I want to take a look at the idea of monotheism. So in particular, we'll get into definitions here in just a little bit, but throughout history for a long time, most of the world is what we call polytheistic. They believe that there were multiple different gods. It wasn't until, relatively speaking, somewhat recently, that the idea that there's but a single god emerged in some places and still doesn't really have a foothold everywhere. So what I want to do is take a look at a couple things. First, we'll take a look at the transition from polytheism to monotheism. Again, this is something where I'll be as brief as I can be here, but I want to at least give you some of the understanding of theologically and conceptually how that transition happened and what some of the implications of it are. Second, we'll look at Judean religion and what eventually becomes Judaism. We're talking about kind of different things. We're talking about temple sacrifices in Judea versus rabbinic Judaism, which is kind of what we know as Judaism today. We'll talk about Christianity. We'll probably spend more time here than on the others, just because that's where more of my background is, so I can give you more relevant information there than I can in some of the other areas. So if you notice a focus in time, that's the reason. It's not because it's more important, it's just because that's what I know more about, so I can tell you more about more effectively. And then we'll also talk about Islam, as these are the three sort of Western monotheisms. If we have time, optimism gets an honorable mention. It is also a monotheism that does not belong to the same track that these three are from and emerged in Egypt briefly for a little while and then got squished. But if we have time, we'll talk about that too. Just two notes. The approach that I'm taking toward these texts and toward these religions is a historical or anthropological approach. I am not presuming or making any statements about whether these things are true, correct, good, bad. True, we'll talk a little about historical authenticity, but in the larger capital T truth of the universe sort of sense, that's not my point. I'm not talking about whether any of these beliefs are good, bad, desirable, or undesirable. Likewise, I'm assuming that all the texts that we discuss here were written by human beings. You can believe whatever you want about how those human beings may have been inspired or guided in writing or not writing some of those texts, but I'm operating under the assumption that human beings and interaction among human beings is what ended up producing the texts that we have in front of us, so at least the texts that came to us today. Again, you're welcome to disagree with that, but that's the approach that I will be using so you know where I'm coming from. With that in mind, and all the presentation and PowerPoint and all the slides are available at the end too, so don't worry about it. You're welcome to jot down whatever you want or take pictures, but it just probably might be easier on grabbing at the end. So let's start off with polytheism and monotheism. So there are a bunch that, again, this is something that you could teach an entire college class just on this, so we'll condense it down to 6 or 7 minutes, it'll be great. There are a couple key elements that I want to look at in polytheism and how those change as we shift to monotheism. First of all, in polytheism you get, I know the text is a little bit small, I'm sorry about that. If you have trouble reading it, let me know. I'll be explaining all of it. But in polytheism you have what's often referred to as sort of the meta-divine realm, or primordial realm. So you could use any number of different religions to illustrate this. I'll probably use Greek mythology most often, because that's something that people are probably likely to be the most familiar with here. I mean, I can reference like Marduk and Ashkenita and a number of Babylonian or Sumerian gods, but that's probably not going to do as much for you. So, in terms of Greek setups, for example, the primordial realm is sort of what the gods are made of. So, if y'all have familiarity with Greek mythology, you have the Titans, and then from the Titans come the gods. It's more complicated, but that's the basic idea. But the Titans still came from someplace and something. So, you have whatever this meta-divine realm is, so a realm that is above or beyond the gods, that has laws and that has rules that the gods must obey, right? There are things that Zeus can and can't do. Zeus doesn't get to rewrite reality however he wants. He has things he has to obey. Other gods can be checks against one another, but the important thing is there are sort of laws of nature, or laws of reality that transcend the gods. Second, gods generally end up being personified in a polytheistic setup. Not always, but usually. So either as a natural phenomenon, so sometimes as the storm, or as the tree spirit, something along those lines, but more often they end up having anthropomorphic qualities. They end up being talked about in human terms. They often have a birth, they have life stories, adventures, things that they do, and they have a death. Think Norse mythology, for example, right? Odin, born, does some stuff, at one point sacrifices his eye in order to gain wisdom, and then all kinds of other things happen. But part of the point, though, is this kind of thing links in with the first one, in that, in the Odin story, for example, when he gives up his eye as part of a means of attaining greater power and wisdom, he didn't do that because he decreed it must be that way. There's some sort of larger cosmological law that required sacrifice for knowledge, and he obeyed that law and then got knowledge. In a polytheistic setup, again, there's there's something beyond the gods that even the gods have to obey. Third, the universe in a polytheistic system generally, not always, but generally is morally neutral. And here's what I mean by that. You may have good and bad gods. You may have malevolent or benevolent gods, and you may have individual heroes or mythological creatures that are good or bad, but the laws of nature, the laws of the universe, the laws the gods must obey, those are not better. If there's someone outside, feel free to wave them in. But those are not inherently good or bad. Think from a Greek perspective, think of the Fates, right? The spinners of fate. They are not inherently good or evil beings. They just exist, and even the gods have to defer to them. So, the universe as a whole, it just is. If I'm a follower of a particular god, that doesn't make me good or evil necessarily. Like those individual gods might be good or evil, but acting in accordance with a god's will is not an inherently moral or immoral thing in the same kind of way. Magic is also possible. By this I mean things that affect the physical world in non-physical ways. Synchronicity is another term that gets used for this. Like I do this ritual over here, and chickens have extra eggs over here, right? And a lot of how magic functions in a polytheistic setup is it's about people or gods. We have plenty of stories, especially in Greek mythology and other places, about gods engaging in magic, where they don't just like snap their fingers and something happens. They do a ritual, or they engage in a particular practice or rite in order to cause something to happen. But in almost all of those instances, it's about people or gods or entities accessing this primordial or meta-divine realm and using its power to cause something to happen. So if I wear an amulet to ward off, Poseidon's anger and get him to not be pissed at me about something, in most cases, that's going to be referencing something that even Poseidon must obey and respect, which is definitionally something beyond Poseidon himself. Likewise, if you think about blood or water or flesh or any number of things that are used to embody the divine, a lot of these things are seen as symbols for this greater, more important concept. You see this when we get into the Hebrew Bible. We see echoes of this as well when they talk about the blood as life. If you're familiar with kosher slaughter practices, a lot of why that has to happen is because in the Hebrew tradition, and this was not just the Hebrew tradition, Babylonian tradition had it the same way, Assyrian, Sumerian, other Mesopotamian areas. In a lot of those cases, blood was seen as having symbolic power to it because it was connected to something beyond. It was literal life, not just stuff that's in your body. So magic is possible generally in a polytheistic setup because you can in some way connect to this meta-divine realm and use its power to enforce its laws on stuff here on Earth. Last, the primary struggles in a polytheistic setup are generally between the gods. So like Zeus and Hera, they got some issues, right? And so a lot of things that play out are those gods set against one another. If you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? All of this is about mostly issues that gods had and problems that gods set up with one another. Humans kind of get caught in the middle. Sometimes we distinguish ourselves by being pretty good at stuff or working with or against different gods. But fundamentally, it's these gods, these primordial forces that are opposed to one another, and we're just also here along for the ride. But the essence of the story is generally that clash. Switch over to monotheism. And in doing so, or the most significant thing that I would argue, and again, all of this is debatable. I'm giving you my perspective on it, and it is widely shared from a scholarly perspective, but by no means universal. The shift to monotheism is not just quantitatively different, it's qualitatively different. So it's not just that you subtract gods until you get to one, and then boom, monotheism, right? It's something more transformative that happens. There's something called, I always pronounce this wrong, monotheism. There's a term that means basically one supreme god, but acknowledging other gods exist. Like, there are a bunch of gods, but mine's the big or my god is in charge of all these other gods. That's kind of, in some ways, sort of a halfway point in between these two. But in most cases, that god, the sort of supreme god, is usually a creator that's very hands-off, like made stuff and then went away. And that god functions the same way as sort of the meta-divine realm. If you look to Yoruban religion out of Africa, Olodumare is the sort of the Orisha who largely created everything. And then all the other Orishas are the ones you actually interact with. Olodumare isn't someone you ask for anything. That's not Olodumare's job. Olodumare made stuff, and then stuff is, and things go from there. So, in some ways, that's sort of an intermediate step. When you come to monotheism, though, the nature of the meta-divine realm, that concept changes significantly. There is no meta-divine realm when you have a monotheistic setup like the Western monotheisms. where if there is only one God, then there are no rules that God must obey, because that God is the rules, right? When's the last time that you all can think about where someone has said God has to do something? Unless that's something that God decided for God's self that God had to do, there's no external force that can compel God in a monotheistic setup, which to me, at least in the monotheisms that we tend to interact upon with. So unlike the polytheistic realm, there's nothing beyond or above or larger than or compelling to God. Second, God is generally disembodied in a monotheistic setup. Not always, but often. And this is where, in particular, things are kind of interesting when you look at so the old Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, different terms that refer to the same general set of stuff. There, you don't generally see God described in person-like terms, right? Occasionally we'll get some references, especially early on, to things like God's hand or like God's strong right hand sort of concept, but we don't ever get he was an old man with a beard, stood about this tall, and held this sort of thing and was dressed this way. We totally get that about Odin. We get that about Zeus. We don't get that about Elohim, or whatever term you'd like to use for God. And that kind of non-personification is sort of important because God transcends this sort of human-like quality, whereas in a polytheistic setup, many, though not all, many of the gods are in a lot of ways humans writ large, or forces of nature writ large. Here it's something that's largely beyond that. This gets really interesting when we deal with Jesus of Nazareth and how that gets wrapped into the tradition. We'll get there if we have time. But generally speaking, in monotheism, your God is to be disembodied. This is the other thing. This is, I think, one of the most important things. The universe becomes morally charged rather than being morally neutral. So when we're dealing with a polytheistic setup, right, the fates, for example, in the Greek setup, they aren't good or bad, they just are. The rules are the rules, and that's the way it is. And the gods do the best they can within that. And so if you aren't obeying the rules of nature, your life's going to suck, because nature's going to be mean to you, but it doesn't make you an inherently bad person in some way. If you defy the will of Athena, that does not make you a morally bad person, right? Maybe followers of Athena are not going to be happy with you, but that doesn't make you inherently evil or bad. Here, however, when God becomes the meta-divine realm, in a sense, not quite, but close, it means that the universe and the laws of the universe are laws that were written by God. Because remember, there are no laws that God has to obey, except potentially laws that God, him, her, or themselves made. So if all the laws are of God, that means definitionally they are godly, and especially if we're using the interpretation that the Hebrew religion comes out of initially and the other monotheisms follow, they are inherently good, right? If God made everything, and God is good, that means that all the laws that God made must also be good. And that means if you ain't doing one of those things, you're doing a bad thing. So, in particular, divergence from God or disagreement with God becomes morally bad or evil here in a sense that it was not necessarily from a polytheistic standpoint, especially because there you could disagree with one God while agreeing with another, and then you might have people might subjectively say, you're bad because you don't agree with my side, but there is no inherent evil in the same kind of way that comes from defying God. And also consequences for defying God are generally less spiritual and they are more physically manifested, if that makes sense, like your kids get sick or something. Magic is generally largely impossible in a monotheistic, not entirely, but largely impossible in a monotheistic setup from a position of faith. And a lot of that is because, remember, a lot of how we're over here making magical thinking type stuff work is you're accessing natural laws that are beyond God to then make things happen. You don't get to make God do stuff, right? The nature of magic is making something in the supernatural world do a thing you want it to do. And there is nothing in the supernatural world except God, or derivations of God over here. And definitionally, if you're human, you ain't making God do your work for you. So it means that magic largely doesn't happen. You do still have intercessionary prayer, and this is where you might ask God to intercede and come down and do a thing for you. But even then, it's not magic in the same sense that you are. Magic over here is generally a formulaic sort of thing. Like, I do this ritual here, and this thing happens over here, at least if I'm good enough at what I did. That's the idea. Over here, there's not a question of did I pray good enough, right? If God doesn't cure my cancer, I didn't get the prayers right. That's not the way that we look at it, right? Because it's not a cosmic vending machine sort of thing. Like, put ritual A in, get result B out. So you don't get magic in the same kind of a sense. This gets a little complicated when we get to different versions of monotheism that end up in that sort of intermediate territory of monolatry, where you have a supreme God, but then you have a lot of other pseudo-divine beings underneath that God. You might be able to petition them and get them to do stuff. So angels fill this in some setups. If you look at a lot of the mystical or occult traditions, especially back in the early 1900s, the Order of the Golden Dawn, Crowley, all that kind of stuff, there, Kabbalah, well, a couple variants of it, there, a lot of that is about trying to get different angels or principalities or semi-divine beings to do things for you. It's not about actually getting God to do it. So again, it's just in that weird category where you have a supreme God, but then you also have things that humans can interact with and manipulate in some way. But when you're not dealing with that sort of intermediary, you're all over here.
I was going to ask, I was thinking of indulgences.
Yeah.
And that was sort of springing yourself out of purgatory.
Sort of, yeah.
For Christ.
To a degree, yeah. And that dealt with the relation between the priesthood and God, and there, and this, when we talk about the Reformation, we will. I'm guessing we won't, but the basic idea there is that you aren't making God do a thing. God, in sort of the Catholic setup there, has said, these are the rules, and here are the people who get to assist in administering those rules. And so those people then use their discretion to administer them in a certain way. Yeah.
And I imagine you will get into the discussion of how humans were able to figure out what God's laws are.
Oh, that's most of
And,
today.
and who had the best set of laws? And that's
That question I will not answer, but the first, because I don't have an answer on that one, and that's going to be somewhat subjective. I'm happy to go into more detail too and provide more information such that you can come to your own conclusion, but I don't want to take a definitive stance with that. I think I know I'm not that smart or whatever. Or omniscient. Last thing here. The struggle over here is primarily between different gods, right? Athena and Aphrodite get into a tiff, or actually Artemis and Aphrodite more likely get into a tiff and something happens. Over here, the major conflict is not between gods, it is between God and humanity or human nature. Especially when you look at the Hebrew Bible, you see this all over the place. The Tower of Babel. It's an excellent example where humanity does something, God's like, and then smash. Garden of Eden, humanity does something, God's like, smash. Right? A lot of the flood, humanity is being super evil, God's like, flood the world. So it's a lot of humanity doing a thing and God responding, and then humanity dealing with that. So go for it.
All right, that sounds more like the father punishing the bad children who won't learn.
Potentially, yeah.
On the third one down, universal morally charged. That's the black and white, good and bad.
Not necessarily.
Because I was raised Jewish, and I was good and bad may be defined at the extremes, but everything is really shades of gray is what I was taught.
And this is more the idea of actively defying God is bad from a moral perspective. And again, different religions will shade this in different ways and will interpret this in different ways. But that becomes something where over here, that concept is much more flexible, right? It is possible to be a good person and be defying a God. Whereas over here, that is harder to do, though by no means impossible. So, let's start off with Judean and Israelite religion. There's a reason I use that terminology to begin with, and that's largely because the religion changes fairly significantly. It's one of the older ones we've got in the Western tradition. Hinduism and Buddhism actually surpass it by a ways, but we're not going to go there today. So, I'm going to do a fairly brief history of some of the big milestones. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly just for time's sake, but I just want you to have a general idea of what's on. So, sometime before 1200 BCE, BC before the Common Era, this is generally the way that academics use this rather than AD and BC these days, especially because Jesus almost certainly was not born in 0 AD, probably around -4 AD. So, anyway, so sometime before 1200 BCE, the Israelite and the Judean religion begins. This is what we call the Patriarchs period. So this is where you have Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Rebecca, etc. That's all happening here. Around 1200 BC is the first time we get a historical mention of the Israelites. We get this in an Egyptian text, the Egyptian stuff that we've been able to find. There's a brief mention of a group called the Israelites that exists somewhere over in what's called Canaan, which is the area largely where Israel and Palestine are now. Around about 1000 BCE, 1050 really, this is where we get the first kingdom of Israel that we know about. Saul is the first king, and at this point there's a united kingdom of Israel and Judah, the two different kingdoms that are ruled jointly. Saul's in charge. This ends the sort of patriarchs period. This is where we get to the monarchic period in This is Israel as a nation rather than up here. It's more Israel as a group of people and part of almost a family type tradition of things. So once from there, we run into a couple different issues where the Israelites or the Judeans get conquered by a bunch of people a bunch of times, like most people around that time did, like empires were a thing. So the Assyrians come over and they take over around 700 BCE. They're sort of this is kind of a patron-client relationship where the Assyrians are technically in charge, but the Judeans have to like give them money and stuff. The kingdom of Israel gets pretty much destroyed at this point, so the kingdom of Judah is the only one that's left carrying on this particular tradition. So around about 700, Assyria ends up conquering there. You go down to just Judea. Things work out kind of okay until the Babylonians show up around 600 some BCE, and you get what's called the Babylonian exile. It's where Babylon comes in and conquers Babylon. Babylonians show up, and when they conquer Judah, they take, not everybody, but they sort of take the elites of the Judean society, so the wealthier people and the priesthood and whatnot, and they kidnap them basically and take them to Babylon as hostages. And this is a bit of a challenge for Judaism, for Judean religion at the time, because their whole thing, at this point, this is when Judaism is Judean religion is sort of starting to shift toward monotheism. Up until this point, God often talks about God as sort of one among others. You actually find some passages in the Old Testament where
Thou shalt not have no other gods before me, for I
Yep.
am the most powerful and jealous God.
Exactly, which sort of implies that there are other ones. You also get to a number of different instances where God speaks in the plural, like, oh, we should go down and do this, or instances where it's God talking to sort of a council of different people, or at least that's the idea. So all of these things, you're moving from sort of that monotheistic, so where you have a supreme God over other gods setup, into a more monotheistic sort of setup. All right, back in. So Babylonian exile. This is the other thing. The temple gets destroyed. The center of Judean religion up until this point, from here, from the beginning of the kingdom on, is the temple in Jerusalem. Like that is the thing. That's where you go to offer sacrifice and do worship to God. That's the place. That's the center of everything. The Babylonians come in and they destroy it. So again, this is kind of a crisis of faith. Like the thing which is the center of your worship, and just got destroyed, and your God kind of got beat up in your eyes. So how's that work, and how is your God still supreme when all that just happened? There's a lot of commentary that's been written about how and why the Judean faith dealt with this. I'm not going to go into it because our time is limited. But around 500 BCE, Persia conquers Babylon. Cyrus the Great comes in and he says, all right, Judeans, you can all go back to Judea now, we're cool. They go back, they rebuild. This is where we get to the Second Temple period. It's in this chunk of time where Judaism fully embraces monotheism. Largely the people who were exiled in Babylon are the ones who started to embrace it and they brought it back. You also encounter Zoroastrianism for the first time. We're not going to talk about this very much, but just want you to know this is Persian religion. And Zoroastrianism is not monotheist, it's dualist. It says there are two divine beings. It's Ahura Mazda and Ahriman are the two divine beings. And it's not good and evil necessarily, it's light and dark. And these two beings are constantly struggling against one another. And that's sort of the dynamic. And so once Judean religion encounters Zoroastrianism, that's the first time Shaitan's the Arabic, it's Satan. It's the first time the character of Satan emerges, and the book of Job is written during this time.
I'll always say the opposite of God because he's the other polarity.
Yep, designed to be an adversary, not actually an evil being, just an opposing being. Judaism doesn't do anywhere near as much with this as Christianity does. We'll get there later. Last, the Torah is largely compiled, we believe, during this time period. I'll talk in just a second about how that happens and what goes into that. But this is where purity laws emerge. This is where all the various texts and beliefs that exist in the Israelite Judean religion kind of get codified into one thing. So, from there, we're sort of Second Temple period. We're sort of chilling out. We're back in Jerusalem. Stuff's good. Temple's rebuilt. Huzzah! Goes on for a couple hundred years. Then Alexander the Great comes in and does what he does, which is conquering. After he conquers them, he rules the Greeks, the Greco-Roman Empire rules over Judea for quite a while. Eventually, they really start pushing things in a group called the Maccabees. The Maccabean revolt happens. It's a group of people, Judean folks, who are really not happy with Greco-Roman rule. They rise up, kick the Greeks figures out, sort of. Please convince the Greeks it's too much work to try to keep policing them the way they have been. Hanukkah is a celebration of the rededication of the temple after the Maccabees kicked other people out. Incidentally, it's preceded by something called the Abomination of Desolation, which is one of the coolest phrases ever. And it's where it gets referred to in a couple different places, both before and after, depending on how you read things. But it's basically a real bad thing. But specifically, it's when, I believe, I gotta remember this right, Antiochus Epiphanes, who's one of the Greek leaders at the time, he's really pissed at the Judeans. So he goes to the Judean temple, which you're not supposed to do if you're not part of their religion, goes into the Holy of Holies, which you're not supposed to do unless you're a specific part of the religion, within the priesthood and all that, brings a pig in there, which you're also not supposed to do because, unclean. Conducts a blood sacrifice in there, which you're also not supposed to do because, unclean and blood sacrifice and blood bad, and does it to an idol for a different god, which you're also not supposed to do because, God is God and not that, and that idol is himself. Literally takes a pig into the Holy of Holies and sacrifices it to himself. I have a hard time conceiving of a more offensive way to treat a religion. In response, largely, the Maccabees are like, screw this, and they rise up, and that's the Maccabean revolt. It's a little more complicated, that's basically it. Things go for a little while until about 100 years later, Rome comes back and is like, all right, the Maccabean thing happened a while ago, we want this area again, we're in charge, deal with it. So Rome conquers Judea again, about 63 BCE. We sort of chill for a while with Rome in charge, but with local governors who have a fair amount of autonomy. King Herod is one toward the end. And around about 30 CE is when Jesus of Nazareth is active, born somewhere around 4 or 6 BCE. Around 70 CE, the Second Temple was destroyed. This is pretty much the end of this period of Judaism, the Second Temple period. This is where we begin the diaspora, which is pretty much most of what we've gotten up until now. From about 70 to 250, Christianity starts to separate from Judaism. It largely begins as a sect within Judaism, which I think a lot of folks misunderstand. And it separates out. We'll talk about that in more depth when we get to Christianity. Around between 300 and 600 CE is when you get Rabbinic Judaism, which is a form of Judaism that we know now. So not centered on a temple in Jerusalem, but much more diverse, much more dispersed. So that kind of gets us to the end of at least the timeline of what I'm going to cover for Judaism, because I'm most interested in the formation of traditions rather than things from there. So, again, incredibly briefly, and not doing it anything close to the justice it deserves, as I will do with the other religions, a few essential concepts to know when it comes to Judaism with regards to the monotheistic tradition. First, there's only one God. That name's God is Yahweh. Sort of more complicated thing I can get into there. There's an argument, actually, this is not necessarily.
Yahweh's not really a name. It's not telling you what my name is.
Exactly. Yahweh means I am. So someone asks God, what's your name? He goes, I am. No, I am, but I am.
That was it. I'm
Yeah.
not language I am.
Yep. So, Yahweh. Part of the reason for this, actually, is in the ancient world, having the name of a being granted you power over it. So that's why if you think about the standard exorcism sort of setup, it's tell me your name is one part of that. Jesus, when he exorcises demons, demands their name. I am Legion, but we are many, and he gets exiled at this point. Anyway, demanding the name of being gives you power over it, so God doesn't give his name to humanity. It's like, I'm not falling for that one. No, I am. So terms that get used there, Yahweh, Adonai, Lord, Elohim, one who's godly, in the singular God in this sense. So one God. That God has a bunch of traits that are relevant. That God is omnipotent, can do anything. Omnipresent is everywhere. Omniscient, knows everything. Eternal, wasn't born, will never die. Disembodied, doesn't have a specific physical body that exists anywhere. Was the creator, made everything that existed, theoretically including him, her, himself, and is just and merciful. Also, being disembodied, God doesn't have a gender on this side. Second thing, and we'll come back to this concept, and then a lot of these are things that are in further iterations in other religions. There's a concept of a covenant with God. I'm massively oversimplifying this. The idea is that the Jews keep God's law, God continues to care for them. It's a lot more than that, but that's kind of the basic idea. And there's a lot of argument as to whether it's a bi-directional thing. So if we stop doing this, and this is what the Babylonian exile creates a lot of problems for. Why did the exile happen? Why did Babylon get to conquer us? Well, it must be because we stopped following God's laws, or at least somebody did. And so that's why all this happened, because there's no other explanation. This is a question of whether it's a bi-directional covenant or a unidirectional. Is this something that God is going to do no matter what? We're doing, we obey the laws because we should, but it's not like if we stop doing it, then God's going to do bad things, or at least stop protecting. And again, there's debate on both sides on that one. Though modern Judaism, I don't think, usually uses the bi-directional thing. Though, again, lots of different sects and different approaches. There's a big focus generally on action over simple faith and belief. When we get into the Protestant Reformation, this becomes a distinction that you'll note there, that it's more similar to how Catholicism and Islam work in some ways. And finally, there are differing views on the afterlife in Judaism, but it's nowhere near as much of a focus as it is in Christianity and Islam. There's a lot more focus on how you act and live here and now, less focus on what happens afterwards. Last bit, Jewish identity is interesting and complicated in a way that some other religions are not, in that it is both defined culturally and also defined religiously and also defined ethnically. And that one can be born Jewish, in that specifically you're the child of a Jewish mother, or in some sense, of a Jewish father. Or you can convert to Judaism. It is difficult, but it is possible to do. So you've got those sort of dual interpretations going on there, in terms of whether one is Jewish from an ethnic or from a cultural standpoint, or Jewish from a religious standpoint, or from an ethnic and cultural, but not religious, where people may be part of the community but may not necessarily believe. In the same way that people are culturally Christian, you think of them as Christmas, Easter Christians is the term you often apply to them, right? People who nominally believe in the religion, or at the very least subscribe to the general practices of it, even if they don't really take a theological stance. So that happens in all religions, but Judaism, because of the hereditary nature of it as well, in some cases, complicates that a bit. All right, let's talk a bit about how the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible is usually the term that gets used. This is in particular the Torah, the Tanakh, the five books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, how those came together. What I'm going to explain now is what's called the documentary hypothesis. There are a bunch of different approaches, but this is widely accepted as not the whole of the story, but a big chunk of the story by most people who study this professionally. And the basic idea is that the Torah was not, someone didn't sit down and write it all at one time. The belief used to be that Moses sat down, wrote the whole Torah, and that's how we got it. Problem is, part of the Torah talks about Moses' funeral. So that makes that a little hard to work with. Again, God waves his hand and make it past that. But generally speaking, from a scholarly perspective, we tend to accept that there are a bunch of different sources that were pulled together by editors who wove them into an overarching narrative. And so a lot of this explains also why you have a lot of duplication in the Bible. Like Genesis has two creation stories, one right after the other, Genesis 1, Genesis 2. In one case, God creates the earth in 7 days, and the other, he just makes it all in 6. In one case, he creates Eve by taking a rib out of the earth's creature, Adam. In another case, they're just both there. What's that?
Creating them both equal at the same time.
Exactly. So you have multiple different stories that tell a similar thing, but in different ways, and this is part of the explanation for that, is that the people who are putting it all together said, well, we have different chunks of our community that think these two stories are important, rather than try to decide which one we're going to keep and disenfranchise one part of the community and kick them out. We'll just keep them both and let people decide what to do.
A good part of those 5 books is historical. You can actually find the evidence of the events. However, they're not in the right order.
Sort of.
So they might be
Longer-
oral histories being passed on.
That's part of it too.
Stories on stories, and then they put them in a book.
Yep, that is also part of it too. The oral history is definitely where this resides for a long time before we get things written down. Here are the 4 big sources that most folks will agree exist. You have, it's called J, the Yahwist. It was the person who first developed these was German, so Yahweh there starts with a J. But you have the Yahwist source, which is very focused on the kingdom of Judah. Probably most of these things date back to around 950 BCE. You have the Elohist. The reason we use these terms is these are the names they use to refer to God. And because God is referred to in different ways in different parts. And part of the theory here is that there's a reason for that, and that's that different groups talked about God using different terms. One group uses Yahweh, another group uses Elohim. And so that's part of how we can identify and separate out, as best we can, these different sources. The Elohist source, that focuses more on the kingdom of Israel, the other kingdom, and that one probably dates to around 850 BCE is our guess. You have the Deuteronomic source, which is basically just the book of Deuteronomy is these folks. They didn't really have much of anything outside of that from what we can tell. And this probably is between 720 and 620 BCE. And then you have the priestly source. This is by far the most formal source. This is probably the last one as well. around about 550 CE, so this is during the Babylonian exile. And this is very focused on religious governance and on purity. A lot of the things about not mixing unlike things, a lot of that, most of Leviticus, all comes out of the priestly source. So they're also likely the final editor. They're also very concerned with genealogy and whatnot, which is part of why, if you look through the Hebrew Bible, a lot of the transitions between one chunk and another is a genealogy. That's likely the priestly editor, that whoever that source is, using that as a way to get from one thing to the next. So these are the different sources that most scholars will agree came together to form the Hebrew Bible. Yeah. But exactly, it doesn't mean that any one of these are better or worse or more or less right than the other, but it means that there are reasons why you will find, at least if you look at it from a non-religious perspective, or at least a non-literalist perspective, you will find potential contradictions and whatnot. This is part of how we resolve that. Yeah.
You said the change from polytheism to monotheism was transformative. Could you comment a couple sentences on that?
A couple sentences.
Yeah, did somebody wake up some morning and say, you know, I think this would all work better if we had one God?
Yeah. That's a great question. I honestly don't. And this is part of where I suspect, and this is purely my own guess, I do not have scholarly work to back this up, but I suspect that that sort of thing requires some sort of major traumatic event. The Babylonian exile may be that event. But generally, for people to radically rework their beliefs about how the world functions, not just tinker around the edges, but utterly jettison and rework them, requires something massive and chaotic to shake everything up. So that would be my guess, but we really don't know. And again, there's sort of this bleed over from God as supreme among others to the only one. We don't know exactly when that happens, except that sometime in that Babylonian period, shortly after.
You have done so much research. Have people written about this?
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah.
So very much. At the very end, I actually have a list of books that I'm going to recommend and authors who can go into a lot more detail on all
About
this
this
stuff.
transformative stage.
That one, yeah, I'll point you to a couple people. There's actually Christine Hayes, professor at Yale, has a series of lectures that she does. You can find them online. At least one of them talks about this. To some degree. Yeah, then I got to keep going.
All right, as a kid, Abraham.
Yep.
Didn't really say there was only one God. He said stop worshiping idols.
Yep.
That's supposedly what we're taught at the beginning of Judaism.
Yep.
We're
And
not
that's
worshiping
why.
idols, but he never said, he said there was a main God, maybe.
Yep. And that's the
He
sort of.
never said the word others.
Correct. And that's back in the patriarchal period. Remember, all these things get compiled together later on, but Judaism or Judean religion really does sort
There
of
also seems to be a goddess at that point.
potentially, yeah, Lilith as one option there. But yeah, complicated, but I got to keep going because we're running low on time already. So let's go from Judaism or Judean religion to Christianity. First off, around about 406 BCE, a group of undocumented refugees fled to Egypt and had a kid. Well, there was a kid involved, no one's really sure who did what. But Jesus of Nazareth gets born. Actually, he probably does not flee to Egypt, realistically, he's probably born in Nazareth. The birth stories, which we'll talk about in a sec, are not into actually, I'm gonna do this now. So especially with Christmas around the corner, it's worth noting the birth stories are not intended, I would argue, and most historians and religious studies scholars I think would agree with me, are not intended to be seen as historical narratives. They're not intended to describe historical fact. They are intended as narrative prologues, if that makes sense. So they're not, and this is the case for a lot of the writing that we get in scriptural texts. We tend to read these things as if they are history, the way our historians write history. They're not intended that way. They're intended to convey important concepts rather than important details. So for example, tangent off a little bit, but we have Josephus, who was a historian way back in the day around this time. He writes a lot about Roman events and conquests, and he'll describe a battle where the Romans had legions and troops numbering 10,000 who conquered troops numbering 1,000. We know that there were less than 2,000 Roman legionnaires in the entire area of the empire over there, so it's freaking impossible that what he described literally happened. But we also know that their opponents were like a small village. So that ain't the case. His point is not that the numbers were this big. His point is that the event was as significant as if there had been this many people there. So it's the way that information is conveyed is not intended to be literal, it is intended to be figurative in that way. That's the way historians, and that's the way people wrote at that time, generally speaking, in this area. So when we try to go back and project a literal understanding of these things on the things that were not written in that way, we run into a lot of trouble. And again, there are religious reasons why people may decide to do that, but from a sociological, anthropological, or historical perspective, that is, I think, an inaccurate, or at least incomplete reading of what's happening. But getting back to the narrative prologues, y'all know like your standard manger scene, right? What do you got there? Like, what's your little nativity scene?
Shepherds,
Shepherds?
wise men,
Wise guys. What else?
Star,
Star. Yeah. What else?
Animals.
Animals. Yeah.
the major.
Yeah. Manger's usually there. There's usually like a Jesus thing because that's kind of a thing. It's a minor detail, I'm sure. So, interesting fact: if you try to go to any of the Gospels, you will not find a single Gospel which has both shepherds and wise men in its story. You will find one story, I believe, I always get these confused, I believe it is Luke that has the wise men and Matthew that has the shepherds, not backwards. But you will not find the same description of both. We take both of those and sort of merge them together to create an overall picture, but the reason these are different is they're trying to convey different things. So Matthew's story, that's the whole flight to Egypt and whatnot. And Herod's going to kill all the baby boys, Jesus and his family flee to Egypt, they take refuge there, and then they eventually come back to where they're supposed to be. Matthew, and we'll get to this in a second, Matthew is writing largely for a devout Judean audience. He's writing for Jews who know the tradition of Moses very well. And Moses' birth story very much echoes this. And a lot of Matthew's point is Jesus is basically the next Moses. And so that's the reason that gospel is opened that way, not to tell you that is what literally happened, but to tell you that these events give that Jesus is the next echo of Moses. And so as you pay attention to him, you should pay attention to this guy. Luke, on the other hand, is speaking to generally more educated Hellenistic or Greek people, not exclusively, but generally. And so he emphasizes more wealth and power and authority, because that's more of what's going to get his audience what he wants. Again, not intended to be literal. And then John is a whole other thing. We'll get to it. So anyway, Jesus is born somewhere around 4-6 BCE, or around about 30 BCE. He was most likely crucified by the Romans. There's another guy around the same time called Apollonius of Tyana. He was actually very similar to Jesus in a lot of ways. Was proclaimed to be the Messiah, was crucified by the Romans, didn't get as much press, never got a movement named after him. But Jesus was not the only dude who did this, just the one who ended up getting most of the attention. Around 70 CE is when we start to get the first written accounts of Jesus, we think. So that means for a generation or more, the Jesus story exists only in the oral tradition. Telling stories to one another, but nothing, as far as we can tell, gets formally written down. We think, and there's disagreement here, but the general scholarly belief, I'd say 80% of scholars or more, would say that Mark, which is the first of the Gospels, probably gets written around 70 to 90 CE. Between 70 and 300 is when Christianity begins to differentiate itself from Judaism. A lot of what Jesus does is deal with Judean traditions and with reworking Judean traditions and sort of, depending on your perspective, tinkering on the edges of them, or making some fundamental changes. The idea that Christianity was its own entirely separate thing doesn't really start to emerge for a century or two later. The other thing that's worth noting here is the idea that Jesus as divine is not necessarily something that starts off after he dies. If you look at the Gospels, the resurrection stories, there's a form of analysis called form criticism that gets applied, where you look at how the text is set up and the sort of the genre it's in, the writing style it's in, what words are used in what ways, and what that indicates. And from that, we can sometimes tell when we have different authors writing and what different chunks of text are from where. The resurrection stories are almost all tacked on to the end of Gospels, and from what we can tell, especially the one in Mark, was not there to begin. It was tacked on at a later date. So there is a likelihood that after Jesus died, especially if you look at Mark, Jesus makes very, very few, if any, claims to divinity there. You get much more of those in Matthew, Luke, and a ton of those in John. But in Mark, Jesus is not all about being God. Son of God, yeah, but Son of Man is actually, Gnosticism is the term that he uses most, but not the I am God thing. Like that's very much a John thing. But Mark doesn't really have that. And so there's an argument that most of this early period, at least for 100 or 200 years there, Jesus is more viewed as, again, modern day Moses sort of thing, where a new prophet helping to reshape the religion, very important and meaningful, but not divine. Divination, we believe, happens later. I'm sorry,
It
what?
would be blasphemy. At the time he lived, to
Oh,
claim
gotcha.
himself to be that
Yeah.
would be blasphemy.
Yep.
And the punishment was death.
So, around, actually not around, but at 325 BCE, so Constantine, who's the emperor of Rome, converts to Christianity a little before this. He passes a bunch of laws, because Rome had been super oppressive to Christians before this. Nero was just diabolically horrible to Christians. Like, that's a lot of where the Christian martyrdom stories come from, is Nero, Diocletian, Domitian. A lot of those emperors were awful. But Constantine is like, nah, I'm down with this Jesus dude. Let's go. He passes a bunch of, probably not those words, but you get the idea. Passes a number of laws that allowed Christianity to exist, to flourish a bit, and then part of this process, he institutes the Council of Nicaea. It's a group of a bunch of church people who have some authority in their communities, and they come together to try to decide what the Bible's actually going to be. So at this point, we have a bunch of different stories about Jesus all circulating, some of which are contradictory, a lot of which come from different places. So we need to actually figure out, what does it mean to be a Christian? What is the Bible as we understand it to be? What is the Torah equivalent that this group is going to use? So Council of Nicaea gets together and they look at a bunch of different stuff and they vote. And based on the votes and the trading of votes and influence, we get the Bible we have now. Again, you can certainly make arguments that this may have been divinely guided by God. This by no means precludes a religious understanding of it. But it does explain that this is not something that one person sat down and wrote all at one time. These are different stories that were circulating to bring contention with one another, and there are a lot of stories that didn't make the final version. We'll talk a little bit about a few of those, usually called Gnostic or non-canonical Gospels. Not quite the same, but they're similar. So you get the Council of Nicaea in 325, Constantine dies a little while later, 337, and on his deathbed converts all of Rome to Christianity. So just imagine Romans waking up one day and going, wait, I'm Christian, what? What's that mean? So all of Rome converts to Christianity, and from there on, Christianity sort of becomes the institution. Up until this point, it had largely been an outside group trying to gain recognition against a greater power. It becomes the power at this point. It largely remains that way in most of the world up until today, though it shifts a little bit. Around 610 CE is when Islam begins, which we'll talk about in a second. From 600 to 1500 CE, there's lots of crusades, there's some dark ages, you get some Inquisition stuff, a bunch of Latin things happen. We're glossing over that slightly, as you may have guessed. You have Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1531, which is when Protestantism begins. And
1517. 1517.
Yes, I'm dyslexic. Thank you. What he said, 1517. Luther's Theses, and that's when Protestantism splits up. Thank you for that.
Luther was long dead by then.
Yeah.
Reluctantly so.
So let's talk Gospels. So in Christianity, you have the Christian view has Old Testament and New Testament. Old Testament being the Hebrew Bible, New Testament being divided into two things: the Gospels and the letters, the epistles. Basically, letters that were written by early church people to one another. Many, but not all, by any means, not all. Paul, the Apostle Paul, wrote a bunch of them, though not all of them. The Gospels, however, are stories of Jesus' life. Acts is a little different. It's a story of the apostles after Jesus died, so it doesn't quite fit in either of those categories. But the Gospels are stories of Jesus, what he did, what went down there. And there are 4 of them that are in canonical Christianity: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. 3 of them, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. It comes from the same root as synonym. They are similar. They share similar sources. John is way out in left field, which we'll talk about in a bit, at least from a textual standpoint. But in trying to figure out what's up with the Synoptic Gospels, scholars were trying to figure out where the different information came from, how do we resolve it when different Gospels tell stories in different ways, and they set up this setup. The generally accepted claim, and this, again, there's dispute over this, but I think the overriding thing among scholars is that there were 4 basic sources that the people who wrote all this stuff were pulling from. Mark most people will agree, was the first one of these that was written. And that people later on, the folks who wrote Matthew and Luke, incidentally, these names are not the names of the authors. We have no idea who the authors are. These names were tacked on them later on, a lot later on. But it's the easiest way to talk about this. We still use them. Mark, written significantly earlier, probably before the end of the 1st century. These probably written about 100 years or less after that. So Mark was first. We have what we call Special Al. not like special K, it's even special. Special L and special M. These are a source unique to Luke, and a source unique to Matthew. And then we have what's called Q, or Quelle, in German. It's a sayings gospel, which is another source that we don't have. We only know it exists because there's overlap. So let me go to this colorful graph here. So, now Mark up here, right? Mark's got a bunch of stuff. Yay, Mark. There are very few things that are unique to Mark. You can see this little sliver here. It's like 3 or 4%. So Mark has a few things that are just there and nowhere else. And then a little bit, well, actually, the vast majority of Mark you find written in both Luke and Matthew. Mark is significantly shorter than these two, incidentally. So that overlaps with these. We're pretty sure that those stories were circulating very close to the time of Jesus, so their authenticity is pretty high compared to this. And certainly, it doesn't mean they necessarily describe what happened, but it does mean they describe what people were saying and the stories people were telling about what happened at that time. I'll leave the larger judgment on historicity to people smarter and better informed. You have a small part of Luke that overlaps with Mark, but not with Matthew. You have a slightly larger part of Mark that overlaps with Matthew, but not with Luke. Then you've got some stuff that only Luke has, and some stuff that only Matthew has, and now we get the weird thing, in that Matthew and Luke overlap each other a bit, but the consensus is that Mark was around and these two knew the Gospel of Mark. It was present, it was circulating when they were writing their take. And for all of these people, they were likely trying to write the definitive take on what happened. They probably were not intending these to be read side by side. They were like, nah, people are talking about a bunch of stories. Here's the real deal. It is likely that these two did not read each other's work, just because there likely would have been a lot more overlap or a lot more direct contradiction or contravening between them if they had. Again, the scholarly opinion is these two had access to Mark, they did not have access to one another. Given that, we have to have some way to explain why they still overlap. And based on what chunks overlap, most of them are sayings and parables. If you've ever read the Analects, that's the holy text for Confucianism, anybody? If you ever hear the phrase Confucius say blank, that's a terrible translation, but it's Confucius says blah. So the Analects are a series of really short, pithy anecdotes. So a group of disciples sat down under the tree, and a man carrying a heavy burden came to them and said, why should I carry this burden up the way? And the master said, you should not carry the burden, you should be one with the burden. I just totally made that up. That does not exist, that is not a holy passage. But the point is, this thing happened, Confucius said this, that's it. No context, no before and after, just that snippet. And those are the kinds of stories that circulate in the oral tradition really, really well. Long narratives, those are a lot harder to circulate. So you mess any part of it up, the whole thing falls apart. But it's easy to circulate little sayings and anecdotes about people. So the scholarly consensus is that something called a sayings gospel, or sayings gospels, were likely very present early on. And the closer things are to that, the more likely they are to be close to the time that Jesus was around. Because again, those things are more similar to oral traditions that we see at pretty much every place we study. So over here, this double tradition, the source that both of these are pulling from, because almost all of these are sayings and parables, we are assuming that there is a saying, a gospel of sayings that exists that has been lost to history, that we no longer have. And scholars refer to as Quella, or the chief gospel.
Scholars put out the idea that this is actually a composite character.
Longer discussion I don't have time for, unfortunately, but maybe. And realistically, all of these, we have no idea how many, if any, of these stories are accurate about Jesus. If you are curious, there's something called the Five Gospels, which it's a book. There's a group called the Jesus Seminar. It was a group of religious scholars from all over the world. They got together and spent a decade or two working on trying to hammer out what can we be more or less sure about. They put together the Five Gospels book. It includes the Gospel of Thomas, which we'll talk about in a second. And it goes through and it basically color codes everything in there by how certain or how much certainty we have that it is authentic. And they do a pretty good job. So if you're curious about that kind of thing, I recommend that as a way to see. But these are the different traditions we've got, and this is all out there around the time the Council of Nicaea is trying to figure out what's it actually mean to be Christian, what's our Bible. The other thing here is these Gospels, as I mentioned earlier, have different audiences. Luke is general, actually, let me get the right order. Mark is writing to poor peasants. Actually, if you look at the grammar of Mark in the Greek, there's something called parataxis. It's where you basically start every sentence with and. So I went to the store, and I bought some gum, and my friend was with me, and then we went to the cash register, and then I walked home, and it was really hot, and I had a green shirt on, and I saw a dog. It is a very low quality level of writing. It is what you would expect from someone who's not classically educated, but maybe has just enough to get some of the details down. That is very much the formulation of Mark. Mark is also very focused on the poor, much more so than many of the other Gospels. I think, actually that's Matthew, but Mark, the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, blessed are the meek, etc. In Mark, the saying is, blessed are the poor. By the time you get over to Matthew and Luke, it's, blessed are the poor in spirit. Very different message. And that's the kinds of differences you will notice among these different setups. So Mark, very much directed to poor Judean peasants. From what we can tell, that's the intended audience. Matthew, devout Judeans. So lots of references to fulfillment of prophecy, fulfillment of the law, tons of those come out of Matthew. Mark does very little of that. He's not assuming his audience necessarily knows or cares about that tradition. Luke, much more interested in wealthy Hellenistic people, so Greek by and large, but people beyond just Judeans. Luke is none of these are friendly to rich people, but Luke is much less unfriendly to rich people than some of the other ones. It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich person to get into heaven. That comes from Matthew. Luke does not remind us of that passage. It's not that I recall. So that's sort of the transition there. John is, I can do hours on John. Here's the short version on John. John's weird. And if you read it, you'll notice immediately that this is the case. The language in John is radically different from all of the others. The stories it tells are radically different. The Lazarus story, Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, only in John. And you would think that if somebody raises the dead, that's a story that would make the rounds, right? So it suggests that that among a lot of other things, suggests that the Johannean community was probably a very insular, closed community. There's a lot, one of my former advisor did a ton of really good work on this, arguing that, I'm going to go down a rabbit hole, I'm not careful here in a long time, so hang on, give me a second. So the Johannean community is very focused on insiders and outsiders and making sure that the people know that they're a part of the community and they speak the right lingo to be part of the community. There's a phenomenon called anti-language. It's where people communicate with phrases that don't enhance meaning, but they signal group membership. So, for example, there are ways that people of different ethnicities might talk to one another, different cultures might talk to one another that would not be appropriate or would not make sense if you're someone from a different culture trying to talk to them. There are ways that kids talk to one another and teenagers talk that make no damn sense to me anymore, and probably not to you folks for a little while now, right? Like, I remember when kids started using, they said, that's super tight. And I'm like, what does that mean? That was the moment where I'm like, yep, I'm old. At least I'm getting there. So there are different communities that will use language that is not intended to provide any additional insight, but is intended to identify who speaks the lingo and who doesn't, who is part of the group and who doesn't. If you get the lingo, you're part of us. If you don't understand, you're not part of the group. And so being able to speak the language is part of how you signal your identity there. If you look in particular at evangelical Christianity, they have very, very strongly utilized John as their primary source, and they utilize the language in John really strongly. I'm sorry, what?
No, sorry.
Okay.
Political comment that I
Yeah, well, keep those to the side. But things like being born again, that concept, only in John, nowhere else. Speaking of the Spirit and Jesus being fully divine and all of that, only in John. John has a ton of the stuff like that. For God so loved the world, he sent his only son. John. So a lot of the things that you find here, a lot of those sorts of things come out of the Johannine community. And so John, being much more closed off, is generally also much less accessible to other people. It's much more hostile to outsiders than a lot of these other ones. Again, I can do a lot more on this if we had more time, but it very much does not line up with the other ones. Which then begs the question of how the hell did it get included?
Yeah.
And that gets us to Gnosticism, one of the original Christian heresies. At least by the time we codified it and decided it was a heresy. So, I didn't do this one right, sorry about that. Should be coming in, but okay. I'll note this at the end that Elaine Pagels is the key author on this and has been for decades. The Gnostic Gospels is her book. We'll get on read it, it's good. But here's the basic idea of Gnosticism. It is focused on spirit and flesh over the material stuff. The basic idea is that and this is part of why it's heresy, is it's in some ways not entirely monotheistic, mostly but not entirely. It says there's God, and God created, stuff. But one of the things God created was what they refer to as the demiurge. It's a pseudo-divine or somewhat divine being. And demiurge is what actually created all the material stuff in the world. And a lot of what we have to do is try to transcend that material stuff and ascend back to being one with the Spirit of God. So Gnosticism is all about knowledge and understanding and the Spirit and trying to eschew the flesh and avoiding the temptations and the dedications of the flesh. So part of what that means, though, is it also means that church hierarchy is not a big thing for the Gnostics. They're all about directly understanding and connecting with God. If you hear the whole personal relationship with God, that's very much a modern concept and very much an individualist, United States focused concept that's spread elsewhere. But the beginnings of that you can find in John, and people directly communing. But early on, if I can talk to God directly, why do I need a priest? If you're the Catholic Church, as it's forming now, that's a little worrisome to you. So Gnosticism got stepped on pretty hard in the early days. There are a number of different Gnostic Gospels that we still have fragments or all of floating around. The Gospel of Thomas is the most significant of them. It's a sayings gospel. It's actually really cool. I recommend you find it and read it if you can. I'm sure the library has copies. And if you get the 5 Gospels, it's in there. But the Gospel of Thomas is just a series of different anecdotes and sayings from Jesus. And there's pretty good scholarly evidence that it probably existed much closer to the time of Jesus than the Gospel of John did. Gospel of John is probably around 300 CE. That's when a lot of people put that. So several centuries after Jesus' death. Thomas, there's disagreement in the community, but there's a strong argument that I personally think is correct, that it probably dates to somewhere between 60 and 90 CE, so in the same range as Mark, which is our earliest source. Gospel of Mary is another really interesting one, where Mary is actually the one, Mary Magdalene specifically, is the one who Jesus designates to be the next leader of the church until Peter steps up and is a jerk about it. So it actually posits that the next leader of the church was supposed to be female. You can understand why that one may not have made the final list. You have the Gospel of Peter, which is all about Peter being a jerk. But Peter is the model for the Pope, so you can kind of guess why that one got stepped on. You've got a lot of other ones. Thomas, if you hear the phrase doubting Thomas, there's a good argument that why that got put in was a way to step on the Gospel of Thomas and make people less willing to read or accept that particular set of stories. Because Thomas, he was the bad one, he doubted stuff. Because we have other versions where it's just the doubter, or there's no name ascribed to it, or even a different name. So that's all fun. Down here, this is, I think, really important. So John's description of Jesus, he's the only one who talks about Jesus being fully divine and fully God. A lot of the other Gospels will talk about Jesus ascending to heaven, being the Son of God. They don't generally make the claim that Jesus is God. That claim is very, very much, you can find it if you're trying to interpret it out of the text. You can get things to support it, but it is not explicitly made in the same way in any of the synoptics the way it is in John. The Gnostic interpretation of Jesus, remember, Gnostics think the material world is bad, right? So, material world's bad, how can God be a material thing? That doesn't work. So their perspective was, actually, Jesus was never a physical being. It was just an illusion. He was only spirit. He was actually laughing above the cross. He was never actually crucified. That was all an illusion. And again, if you're founding a lot of your religion on Jesus suffered and died for you, you need to kind of suffer and die. And so the Gnostics are like, it didn't happen, and that also doesn't go over well. But the Gnostics are whole, Jesus being fully spirit, fully God. Early church, not a big fan of Gnostics. But the Johanine community, in all likelihood, had a lot of supporters. If it didn't, it wouldn't have been able to get its gospel included. And John treads very close to that Gnostic line, much more so than any of the synoptics do, in that he does the whole fully divine thing. In all likelihood, this phrasing, the fully human part, is something that was forced in there. I don't know, we don't know this for certain, but it's a theory that I find was likely imposed on there as a condition of getting it included, or that being there is part of what enabled it to be included when all the other Gnostic Gospels, which likely may have had greater claims to authenticity, were excluded. So, yeah, actually, it does sound a ton like Congress or government. No, you're right. Like, that's exactly, the process was a fundamentally political process. It was horse trading. It was people saying, well, I like this letter and this gospel, but I hate this other one. I'll vote for your gospel if you'll vote for my 2 letters from Paul over here. And that's exactly how it happened, as far as we
There's
can tell.
another thing, essentially Hammond, the prophet Elijah. He could just be a prophet.
Potentially, I can't get diverted there though because of time. So, Christianity, key concepts to know. There is one God. That's it. One, capital G, that's it. But there's kind of 3 in 1 if you do the whole Trinity thing. And that's something that's a bit of an issue for some folks. So different Christian sects have different views on this. The Catholic view is mostly that there's God, which includes God the Father, which is the omnipotent creator being thing, mostly talked about more in the Old Testament. God the Son, who is Jesus, who is also that omnipotent creator, but is also separate in Jesus. And God the Holy Spirit, who is out inspiring people, doesn't really have a physical form, was present after Jesus died, well, was present the whole time, was out on the earth doing stuff after Jesus died, but is also God the Creator and is also Jesus. There are times where people have claimed that Catholics are polytheists because of this. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but there's definitely some tension there. There are a number of different sects that don't accept that in the same sort of way. The Mormons, for example, are definitively Christian, but they don't accept the Trinity as a concept that way. Same for a lot of Protestant denominations. Also, you do get some instances where saints take on some kind of pseudo-divine, or the Virgin Mary takes on sort of a pseudo-divine characteristic of an intercessionary. So now we're back to sort of there being an all-powerful God and then lesser divine beings underneath them. Angels can also fill a similar kind of role, but the saints in particular in Catholicism kind of end up filling that role because, again, there's some tension between praying for something and then not getting it. Does that mean I need to do the prayer right? And what is the right way? And there are some people prayer wizards, and how do you figure that out? That's a mess. So the saints or intercessionaries kind of help solve that. This is also a triple OC God, omniscient, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and creator. Same sense as the Jewish God, and generally considered to be the same God. There's one thing that comes with this, though, and we won't take it on today, but it's arguably one of the largest theological problems that monotheism has, and that's the problem of evil, right? If God is all good, if God can do anything, and God knows everything, and created everything, why is there bad stuff? If you got your answer. Like, this has literally been thousands of years of theological debate. And there are tons of potential answers that go part of the way toward getting there, and they all have kind of their own limitations to them. But in the polytheistic setup, remember, there's evil because there are evil gods out there. Problem solved. In this setup, there aren't any evil gods, and if there were, God would have power over them and could make them do whatever God wanted. So if God's letting them do evil stuff, then it's God's fault that evil stuff's happening. That means God's not all good, and that's a problem. So this runs you into a lot of theological dilemmas. There are ways to sort through them, but people have been working on that one for a while. And that's a problem with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam to one degree or another all the time you deal with. And as soon as you get rid of that meta-divine, that primordial realm, as soon as you make it so that there are no longer laws God must obey, God is then solely responsible for everything that happens, or at least everything that God does. Human will and human free will mucks with this a little bit. That's one of the big answers. But it doesn't really deal with things like why natural disasters kill newborn babies. Like, baby didn't sin, nobody caused a natural disaster, so why? Again, complicated. There are answers there. Complicated. Second major belief. Jesus Christ, Christo, the crucified, among other things, the anointed. Jesus Christ was the Son of God and also God himself, born from a virgin mother, Mary, who theoretically impregnated by God, without the physical thing. He lived, died, was resurrected, and ascended to heaven. Communion, central Christian rite. People ritualistically consume the body and blood of Christ. They do that by taking water and, taking wine and taking bread of some kind and transmuting that into flesh and blood. When you say it that way, it sounds a little weird. There's also a focus on salvation and rewards in the afterlife. This is a little different. Judaism is much less focused on afterlife concerns. Christianity puts a lot more focus on that. Islam also puts a fair amount of focus on that. The concept of heaven and hell shows up here. You can find some vague allusions to it in some strands of Judaism, but by and large, it doesn't exist that same way. There is no bad place you go to. It's about wanting to become one with God or become closer to God. Christianity definitively sets up, there's a bad place, there's a good place. There's a TV show about that, it's pretty good. But you want to go to one and not the other.
You're talking about the good place?
I am. So there's also disagreement on what's necessary for salvation in Christianity. This is a big part of what the Reformation is all about. The Catholic Church's approach is generally you need to believe and you need to do certain things. Luther and a lot of the Protestant denominations that come out of that say no, belief is enough. If you believe in God and accept God into your heart, what that means is a little open for discussion. But if you believe and accept, that is enough regardless of your actions. And that's the debate that still rages between different sects. Islam. And we're close to where I expected to be on time, so it'll be a little shorter on this one, unfortunately. So, back in the day, go to about 570 CE, a man named Muhammad is born in the city of Mecca in what is now Saudi Arabia. 610 CE, Muhammad receives the Quran. And here's the way that this goes. The story is that Muhammad at one point is contacted by the angel Gabriel. And again, I'm putting this in colloquial terms. The angel Gabriel shows up and says, dude, we got a problem. So there's God, God's cool. God said a bunch of stuff, there's like Bibles out there, that's great. Christianity, Judaism, they're cool. But they screwed some stuff up. And we gotta set the record straight. So God is gonna tell me, the angel Gabriel, what I need to clarify. And then I'm gonna tell it to you, and you're gonna let people know. So to a large degree, the Quran wasn't all transmitted at one time, though a large chunk of it. And there are other things that come from there, but that's the sort of chain of transmission. Part of the idea there is God doesn't directly necessarily speak to people. Angels are used for that. You're dealing with directly explode, contacting the infinite. Yeah.
So the Quran, as I understand it, is supposedly the actual word of God.
Yes. God to Gabriel, to Muhammad, to everybody else. Yes. That goes through that chain of transmission, but it is the words of God. You're correct. At least that's the way that they talk about it. So the next bit here, the religion or the region that we're actually, one second, let me rewind for a second. A lot of the purpose of the Quran then is to sort of correct errors that, at least this is the interpretation that they have, is to correct errors that have crept into translation and understanding of older stories. I'll point out a couple of examples of those in a bit. But it is intended to be sort of complementary to the next edge on the previous tradition. I'm not necessarily replacing where it overlaps, but it is not intended to say the previous tradition is wholly wrong. It's, in fact, Jesus is the most quoted prophet in the Quran. But it's intended to say, here are things that have been incorrect that we need to fix. The region where all of this happens, in that area, there are significant communities of Jews, significant communities of Christians, and of polytheists or pagans. All of those groups exist in this area. Around 622, Muhammad and his followers flee or move from Mecca to Medina. At least that's the modern day name of the city. Bunch of reasons for this. Muhammad had accrued some followers, and there's something called the Kaaba, which I wish I had a picture of up here, which if you look for it, you'll find it. K-A-B-B-A, I believe is the most common spelling. The Kaaba is this large black square building. It has what's called the black stone. It's a piece of meteorite in the side of it. And it is, we'll talk about one of the Muslim pillars of faith, the Hajj, in a bit. But when you go on the Hajj to Mecca, you walk around the Kaaba. But the Kaaba was initially, it was a building that held, a holy site that held idols to a bunch of different gods in it. And one of the early things Muhammad did in Mecca was, there's only one God, God told me so. He walks in and he smashes all the idols that are saying you're not supposed to do idolatry, that's bad. There are some stories that say he found an idol that looked like Virgin Mary and Jesus was the thing, and he draped a cloth over it instead and said, don't smash that, respect that. Different stories about the prophet, which we'll get to in a second, with different degrees of validity. But he kind of turns things on their head in Mecca. He has an uncle who has a fair amount of sway there, so people don't really run him out of town for being in the same way Jesus always got run out of town for upsetting the natural order. But eventually his uncle dies, he loses that protection, he and his followers get chased out. They then go on what's called the Hijra, is the term that gets used here, but they go on the Hijra to Medina, and then Islam continues to sort of build from there. This trip from Mecca to Medina in 622, this is when the Muslim calendar starts. So this is year zero for them. About 10 years later, in 632, Muhammad dies, and there's a significant disagreement about who should be in charge after his death. And this is where you get the split between Shia and Sunni. So Shia, or Shiites, there are a bunch of different variants on it, they argue that leadership should stay within the prophet's family. So his son-in-law, Ali, should be the next person to lead the community. This is the minority group. The larger group, the Sunni, as they later become called, say, no, leadership needs to be decided by the elders of the community. So all of our elders should get together and decide who we most trust, and that person should run the community regardless of secession. So there's this split, the two groups go their separate ways, they come into conflict and come back together a couple times over the years, but now they end up splitting fairly strongly later on. Now it's that kind of thing. So, Key beliefs and practices. I know I'm skipping Islam a fair amount. Apologies, it's a time thing. So the Quran is the word of God, and Muhammad is his final prophet. Islam says there have been lots of prophets. They had lots of cool stuff. That's great. Muhammad's the last one. And so anybody else who claims to be a prophet after this, you're wrong. Second, the Quran is generally, you didn't mention this earlier, generally viewed as correction or clarification of previous things. So an example, if you look to the Hebrew Bible, the story of Isaac and Ishmael, if any of y'all are familiar with this, one of them is the legitimate son of his father, the other is the illegitimate son. The Hebrew and Christian tradition says Isaac is the legitimate son, Ishmael is the illegitimate one. The Quran says, no, you got that backwards. It's actually Ishmael who's the legitimate one, it's Isaac who's illegitimate. Those are some of the kinds of corrections that show up there. And that's where you get the idea, some folks will claim that one religion is descended from one of those, the other from the other. That's not the case, but that's where that claim comes from. There's also a huge focus within the Quran on textual accuracy. This is one reason why, unlike a lot of the other texts, we can be pretty sure the Quran we have today is pretty damn close to the first Quran that was spoken or written down. Because part of the reason it exists is to correct all of these errors. There's a huge focus on making sure that doesn't happen again. So technically, the truest version of the Quran is the spoken version in Arabic. And that's one reason why Muslims will tend to learn Arabic regardless of where they live, when they tend to often read the Quran in Arabic. It's that translation risks misinterpretation, which is definitely true. So it is better to learn the language and be able to read it in the original language, so you're more likely to get what was originally intended. And even then, it's the spoken version that's most true, because the first way the Quran came to earth was it was spoken aloud by Muhammad. So that you'll actually see things like Quranic recitation competitions and stuff that will happen in Muslim nations as a common thing. Like, we have talent shows, that's a thing that they'll do there. It's actually really beautiful in some cases, a lot of it's sung. But that's a huge focus for the Quran, is accuracy and fidelity. One of the other aspects, belief in angels, holy books, prophets, day of judgment. All these things exist, are important, believe in them. That's part of Islam. The other big part are the 5 pillars of Islam. This is mostly about action rather than belief. There's one exception there. First one is the Shahada. This is the profession of faith. There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Roughly translated. And this is saying that statement and believing it. If you've done that, you have done this pillar of faith. This is the only one that's really intrinsically about belief, something in internal faith rather than about actions, which the others generally are. Salah, which is praying 5 times a day, prayer rug facing the Mecca. That's the second one, because it's something that, in theory, every devout Muslim should do. There are differences in different levels of orthodoxy with different people and the degree in which they practice this, but for many people, that's seen as something that is a literal thing they need to do on a regular basis. The next is zakat. This is the giving of alms, to charity. It's baked into Islam. You are required to give a portion, as much as you are able, to the poor and to charity. Muslim charities actually have a good track record. There's some problems with some of them, but they've done a lot with social services in countries that otherwise would be in some more significant trouble. So, significant part of the faith. Swam, which is fasting during the month of Ramadan, from dawn to dusk. You don't eat, you generally don't swallow, if you're depending on how strict you are about it. And then finally, the Hajj. This is the only one that's optional. If you have the ability, at some point during your life, you should make a pilgrimage to Mecca. That is a really important place, and you should go there and experience it. So those are the 5 pillars of faith for Islam. Second, or next, sources of authority in terms of where Islamic laws and rules and beliefs and things come from. 3 sources of authority. First one, Quran. It's in the Quran. It's the law. You do it. Quran is true and is true. Second are what are called sunnah, which are actions of the Prophet, and they are found in hadith, which are the stories about the Prophet. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, because there are a lot of different hadith, and not everybody agrees on which ones are authentic and which ones aren't. There are actually pretty much 3 categories. There's one category that the vast majority of Muslims accept are accurate. The second category, where it kind of depends on which sect you're part of as to whether you say yes or no. And then another category that only small isolated groups accept, but most people generally don't. And so a lot of where you will find some of the more radical, at least what we would perceive as more radical beliefs, are in different hadith that some groups may believe are legitimate and some groups do not. requirements about how people need to dress. You'll find some of those in different hadith. And this is what these are. They're all about how the prophet lived his life. And the idea here is, if Muhammad was the person who got the most info from God about how to live, if we want to be as godly as possible, we should live as close to the way he did as possible. That's the best model we have. That runs into some problems because it does mean that it codifies life in a way that was reflected during Muhammad's time rather than now, which is why some practices end up feeling a bit retrograde in terms of referencing more back to earlier time rather than forward. Again, those tend to be the more conservative traditions. But the reason is that the more you can emulate this individual, the idea is the closer you will be to what God wants. So that's the hadith. That's the Quran. The last source is actually community consensus and reasoning. Islamic law works differently than a lot of other things. Some similarities to rabbinic law, though there's rabbinic law in a lot of ways has more structure to it, or at least there's more, you have to go through more specific things to be a part of it. For Islamic law, pretty much anybody can write out what's called a fatwa, which is a religious opinion. Different people will grant different degrees of authority to different fatwas based on what someone's background is and how credible they believe the person is and how widely respected the person is. But pretty much anybody can write commentary there. There are different schools of thought that tend to produce more or less respected people. But when those two things, when the Quran, the Sunnah, or the Hadith don't answer the question of what you should do, talk to the community. Use your brain, use the community's ideas and figure it out. I've already mentioned this, but different groups accept different hadith, and there's also significant variation in orthodoxy and orthopraxy, which is how people act among different groups. Yeah.
What about Sharia law?
Yep. Sharia really just means law, in the same way that chai just means tea. But Sharia law, Sharia is just, it's like the same thing as if someone said, I believe in biblical law. Well, what's that mean? I don't know. What's Sharia law mean? Different people will interpret it in different ways. Some folks might say, I believe in biblical law, which means you should treat everyone the way you want to be treated. Cool. Some people might say, I believe in biblical law, which believes I should stone any child that is disobedient to their parents. Those two are both interpretations of biblical law that literally come from the Bible. But they're not the same thing. In the same way, Sharia is a similar sort of thing. Some interpretations are, I believe that taking care of the community is super important. Everyone should have to donate to charity and care for the poor. And there should be laws requiring people who have means to donate to those who need it. That is an example of Sharia. Saying that a thief should have their hand cut off is an example of Sharia. People do not necessarily, who accept one, do not accept the other necessarily. There's a wide variety there. So it gets more attention, frankly, because it gets more attention because the more startling claims generate attention, and that generates advertising, and that generates people reading the news about it, and generates outrage, and generates votes. But realistically, people advocating for it, the term itself means very little. It's about how you apply it that matters and what you consider it to be legitimate and not within that tradition. But very good question. Last, we have a little bit of time, so you get the bonus. Okay, go ahead.
I took a course in world religions,
Yeah.
and they indicated Muhammad was illiterate according to historical,
Entirely possible.
and that the Quran was written 40 to 70 years after he.
Probably a generation, probably not quite that long, but yeah, most likely it existed in the oral tradition for a while. And this is also part of why the oral recitation of the Quran is something that people make a big emphasis on teaching and passing on and memorizing, because that's a practice that has been a really essential and important thing from the beginning. And that again is why the true Quran is the spoken Quran, because it was a significant dedication to keeping it that way. So
And
fair
it's
point.
their recognition of
Yeah.
what he said, or recollection
Yep, correct.
of what he said, that's what got written down.
Correct. Correct. So definitely
It's the
possible.
same as Christian
Exactly.
Testament.
Slightly lower time frame than some of these things, especially when you get to like later things like John. But yeah, probably roughly comparable to Mark in terms of the amount of distance that passes between one and the other. One of the big differences, though, is in Mark, or in the Christian instance, there are tons of disparate stories floating around rather than one specific set of things to be memorized and passed on. So again, I think there's probably more fidelity on the end of the Quran, but that's an open question. So let's talk optimism, and then I'll stick around until Danny kicks me out to answer your questions you got at the end. So Aten, he was fun dude. Pharaoh back in the day, it was Egypt's brief fling with monotheism. So Egypt, ancient Egypt does its thing. You got the pharaoh, who's kind of god, but you've got the actual gods above the pharaoh, which are a thing as well. Around 1345? Yeah, 1348 BCE, Amenhotep IV becomes pharaoh and is like, I'm gonna be weird. So he renames himself to Akhenaten. He declares formally a god that had been just a minor sun god, Aten. He says Aten's actually the god in charge of everything now. He relocates his capital to a new city, renames that city Akhenaten as well, and goes on to rule from there. People are not too impressed with this. He has followers, but there's a significant split. About 6 or 8 years later, he goes a step further and says, not only is Aten the king of the gods, Aten is the only god. There are no gods but Aten. And I am Aten's representative on earth. And that also doesn't always go over all that well. So about 12 years later, a plague wipes out most of his court, most of the people who were there with him. Nefertiti, which you may have heard of, because there's the famous bust of her in the museum, in the British Museum and among other places. Nefertiti was briefly pharaoh after him, who also followed Atenism, but likely tried to negotiate it to make it more of the monolithist, where there's the supreme god among others rather than the only god. But she disappears a few years later, and successive pharaohs pretty much wipe out all trace of this as much as they can, because it was sort of weird and an aberration they don't want to talk about. So brief monotheism for a couple decades, and then back to polytheism for a millennia or so more. That's Atenism. Felt it deserved an honorable mention. They tried. In terms of books, these are ones that I would recommend taking a look at, and authors I recommend. So, Elaine Pagels, if you're interested in the Gnostic Gospels, so these are Gospels, so 2 terms, Gnostic Gospels and non-canonical Gospels. There's some overlap, but they're not the same. Non-canonical Gospel just means stories about Jesus. Non-canonical Gospels are Gospels and stories about Jesus that didn't make the canon, didn't make the Bible. Gnostic Gospels, most, if not all Gnostic Gospels, are also non-canonical, because they didn't make the Bible unless you count John as a pseudo-Gnostic Gospel, which did. But Elaine Pagel's book on the Gnostic Gospel, it's a couple decades old, but it is still the definitive scholarly work on this. And it's quite beautiful too. Bruce Molina, Richard Gorbach was actually my advisor back in the day. He's social science. He takes a social science approach toward this. So if you are interested in particular about what life was like then, so the social science approach to the Gospels, or to any study, says that if you want to know what the author intended, because ultimately that, if we're trying to read a text, the point of a book or a story or anything is to convey an idea from one person's head to somebody else's head, right? The text, the words, that's just a medium through which information travels. The goal is to try to get the idea as faithfully as possible from here to there, right? So given that that's our goal, the more that we can understand what idea was up here, the more likely we are to comprehend the correct idea on our end. And the social science approach says the way that you figure that out, the best way to figure out what was up here, is to find out how the original audience would have received the words that are spoken. Because whoever's speaking them wants to communicate the idea, and they want to do it in a way that their audience will understand. So that means figure out how their audience would have understood these words, and you are closer to understanding what was intended than if you try to interpret it with us as the audience, rather than the original people they were speaking to. So Molina and Rohrbach focus a lot on how Mediterranean peasant society worked. There's a concept they didn't get into at all, but it's fascinating, an honor-shame concept, where ethics are function a little bit differently than we're used to thinking about them, where, I can mention on this if I have the time, which I might. There is, remind me, honor challenge. I'll come back to this in a few minutes. Honor challenge. But that's Molina and Rohrbach. Social science commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, also they did one on John. They've done a bunch of stuff. Molina is a more prolific writer of the two, but their stuff's excellent. Robert Funk himself is okay, but he was the guy who was in charge, who was nominated to run the Jesus Seminar, which is this group of 100 academics who study Jesus, the historical Jesus. 5 Gospels is something they put out. Anything else you see by the Jesus Seminar is actually pretty solid. Molina's New Testament world is more about the life at that time. John Dominic Crossan is probably one of the preeminent historical Jesus scholars in the world, and has been for a few decades. He's put out a bunch of books, all of which are pretty decent. Some are all a little sensational, but they're all based on good scholarship. Jesus, the Revolutionary Biography, is a solid one of those. And finally, if you want to move outside of Christianity, I don't have much to recommend here in Judaism, unfortunately, just because that's not where my background or my study has been. So it's not to say there's not good info there, I just am not the best person to provide it to you. But in terms of Islam, Reza Aslan's No God But God, it's an excellent explanation of Islam, both as practiced and interpreted today, and in terms of, from a historical perspective, what parts are relevant to people and how they decide that. So those are the things I recommend. Honor Jake, boys. So honor challenge and then questions until they kick me out. So honor challenge. So back in the day, in Mediterranean peasant society, there's this idea that if I want to know, so if you want to know what's right or wrong, how do you know that? Like today, now. How do you know what's right or wrong? What's that? Universally accepted. Okay, so they're just things that are true, but how do I know those things? Yeah, you walked through a philosophy class accidentally about that. Anybody help me out here? This is not an easy question. Like, how do I know what the universal good and bad is? There are a bunch of right answers to this. What do you think?
Some is intuition,
Sure,
some
what you
is
feel.
written laws and rules.
What you feel, what other people, and this is the consensus thing, what other people have agreed to and written down as laws. Both of those are ways to know. You could say what my religion says, what God says. That's not okay to know.
Weigh what the consequences of whatever it is would be,
Sure.
the good to the bad.
Sure.
Decide you wanna
Weigh it out,
go
cost
toward
benefit
the best
analysis.
outcome and the least bad, so
Sure.
you get a measure.
What my mommy and daddy told me.
Sure, what you are raised with. All of these are good ways to know. Yeah.
In the Germanic pagan tradition, it was a trial.
Yep. Exactly. But
Two quarters of faith and.
we'd see the will of the gods. Yep. Though there, that may not tell you ahead of time which is right or wrong. That's to resolve it when we don't know for sure what it is. But when I'm trying to decide what I should do, in theory, that one may not help me as much, but after the fact, it is useful. In Mediterranean, first century peasant society, part of how you would make that determination is whatever the most honorable and respected elder in my community says is right. And that's how I know. Because they are the most honorable and respected person, so if they say it, that's the way it works. We maintain some elements of that, but we are largely, here in the US, we use a guilt-based ethic much more than an honor-based ethic. We decide what is right or wrong based on what makes us feel good or bad, or what our society has decided works along those lines. But, so in this setup, the most honorable person is the one who gets to decide what's right or wrong. So being honorable is often the same as being ethical. And there are times where you have to kind of sort out who is the more honorable among two people, and there are a bunch of ways to do that. The honor challenge is one of the more common ones. And there are positive and negative honor challenges. Positive honor challenge is, I need a volunteer/victim. What's your name, sir?
Hugh.
Hugh? My name's Keith.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Hugh, your glasses are fantastic. Like they bring out your eyes and the framing of your face, and it really makes my day that much better to see you.
My wife will come out.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, right, they call it a purple set.
No. Fair enough. So then, if we were meeting each other, I would offer. I don't forget your name already. Remind me. Hugh. I would offer Hugh a compliment, and then Hugh would respond with a compliment to me, and then I would respond to a compliment back, and we'd go back and forth until either we reach a mutually agreed stopping point. In a positive honor challenge, you can't see. Thank you. In a positive honor challenge, that usually comes pretty quickly. But we go back and forth until we either reach a mutually agreed stopping point, or one of us is unable to respond. At which point that person would lose on. So you see this kind of in courtly battles and like Western court situations, or even in Japanese and Chinese court situations sometimes too. But so I compliment you, you compliment me, we go back and forth a bit, and as long as we're both on the same level, we're fine. That's the positive honor challenge. That's the nice one. That's what you do with friends, just to establish wherever it's at. Negative honor challenges, that's a whole different deal. That's where I walk up and I insult you. And then you insult me. And I insult you, and we go back and forth until one of two things happens. Either one of us cannot respond, in which case we lose, or one of us resorts to violence first. Whoever resorts to violence first loses. Go back and reread the Gospels with that knowledge in mind. Every time Jesus gets run out of town, he's winning an honor challenge. Every time people turn on him and threaten him with violence, he is winning an honor challenge. There's only a single instance in the Synoptics where Jesus loses an honor challenge, and it's to a Syrophoenician woman who comes and begs him to heal her son. Jesus doesn't respond, and he goes and heals her son. So that's that understanding. Oh, there we go, thank you. So that understanding of how an honor-shame system works is really, really useful because it reframes a lot of things that we might look at differently, right? We may look at that as just a set of arguments, but it's doing more than that. It is establishing Jesus is the more honorable and thus more ethical person in this setup. Every time the Sadducees, the Pharisees, which are different Jewish sects, well, there's more to it than that, different groups, every time they clash with Jesus and he wins, or he poses questions to them they can't answer and they are confused, that's Jesus winning an honor challenge and establishing ethical superiority. So that framing is really useful. The other thing that it does is if you are, if there's a larger, if you are the underdog, if you're being bullied or a larger power is oppressing you or pushing you, there's a certain amount of time where you have to stand up to that, after which you can back down and not lose face, basically. That time is 40 days. You may notice that number showing up a fair amount. There are a bunch of reasons, but that's part of it. Jesus goes into the desert, is tempted by the devil for 40 days, and then comes back and he's good. Flood lasts for 40 days. Noah stands up to the greater power of God and hangs out and survives, and it's all good, and then we're done. Now, there's actually a second version of the flood where it lasts 150 days also in Genesis, but we're going to ignore that one for right now. But those kinds of things help to reframe a lot of how we understand things. One more example I'll give you, and then I'll actually take questions. Are any of you all familiar with the parable of the talents? It's one that gets cited a fair amount, actually gets cited by folks who subscribe to what's called the prosperity wealth gospel, which I have a massive amount of distaste for personally, but you can make your own call. So the basic story is this. There is, Jesus tells this parable that there's a master who is getting ready to go out of town, and he has 3 servants. And he gives each servant some money. Talent is a unit of money at that point. So he gives one servant some money, he gives a bit of money to all 3 of those servants. And then he leaves. And when one of the servants takes the money and he spends it fruitlessly and loses it. Second servant buries it in the ground, and then the third servant invests it and makes money off the interest. Master comes back and says, all right, what'd you do with the stuff I gave you? One servant says, I lost it. The second one says, I buried it. Here it is. I took it back up and gave it back to you. The third one says, I invested it, and see, I made more. And then the master punishes the 2 slaves and servants and rewards the one who invested it. The message that we most commonly today take out of this is God gives people talent. Literally, we try to ascribe meaning to the word that translationally doesn't exist. But God gives people stuff, and God wants you to make more of the things that he gives you. Right? But the master is God, and the servants are parables for us, and they are representations of us, and so we should take what we're given and make more of it. That is almost certainly exactly the opposite of how that would have been interpreted at the time it was used. Because, again, Judean tradition, lending money at high interest to make that back violates the Torah. So the servant who made more money has broken the law, and that's the one that the master rewards. Jesus also, the idea of the master as God is not something we set up anywhere else. Jesus is not keen on, Jesus is very rarely keen on economic elite folks. Like, he's generally much more about the poor. And so the argument that I at least would say, and Melina and Rohr will back me up on this, the argument that I would make is that the way people likely interpreted that at the time is, even when people who are in power punish you for doing what is right. Like, people who are in power are going to reward you for breaking the law, and they're going to punish you for doing what's right, and you got to deal with that, and you got to still do what you know is right, even if the world around you tells you it's wrong and hurts you for it. Exact opposite of the way we interpret it now. And that's based on understanding the culture and the context involved and how people would have viewed it. Plenty of other good ones like that, but that's just an example. Any of these books, in particular, Robot Molina, we give you a lot of insight. So, questions? What do you want to know about, like, everything?
In Judaism, you've got Talmud. Talmud, you argue pro and con on any argument to come to a conclusion about where it does. Did Islam first, did they keep any part of that, where the clerics or anybody, people would argue to try to, because that modernizes things.
Yeah, very much so. And that's actually part of why there are different schools of Islamic law now, and there are about 4 or 5 major ones. And a lot of, so things that fall in that third category, the consensus of the community, the things in that third category are definitely argued about in a way that's very similar to the rabbinic tradition of arguing about why certain things should be certain ways, but partially because that is the lowest order of authority and the other two predominate that, it makes it a little harder to reinterpret things up the top with that kind of commentary. So there's not as much flexibility as I think the Jewish tradition tends to allow for, though depending which section of the Jewish tradition you're in, you'd see a different thing, right? Talking to Reform Jews will give you a very different view than talking to Hasidic Jews, in the same way that talking to Muslims who are more liberal here in America may give you a different view than talking to people who live in villages in Pakistan.
There might be more of that, but as one rabbi put it to me, the thing they talk about borrowing someone's camel that applies to the Hertz rental car too.
And this is also an instance where like Muhammad rode a camel to go to Mecca. That doesn't mean you have to ride a camel to go to Mecca. If you want to be like a prophet, you should go to Mecca, right? Like that kind of stuff. There's absolutely commentary that the Islamic scholars spend a lot of time. They actually do a really in-depth job, but partially because that process is really democratized and that you can pretty much anybody can write an opinion and it'll be considered. It gives a lot of different input to that.
Thank you, Keith.
No problem.